I am introducing our two speakers. Our first is Mr. Lee Rumble. Lee is a plant and soil science major. He's minoring in biology, and he is presenting today his thesis titled A Survey of Wounding Frequency Among Trees Found in Urban and Forest Environments. Lee is a certified arborist himself since 2001. He is a transfer student. He came to us from Nashville State. He had a 4.0 there and has maintained that here. He has the highest honor that a student can, the highest scholarship a student can get when transferring in, and that is the Honors Transfer Fellowship. I was on that committee, and I was fortunate enough to read his application several years ago when he applied, and it's so nice to be here to see you present your thesis. His project was advised by Dr. Drew C. And at this time, Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miller. I guess I've been an arborist since 2001, so I spend a lot of my days, a little bit of background for me. As Dr. Miller mentioned, I am a certified arborist, and a certified arborist, for those of you who don't know, is just someone who specializes in the care of trees, preferably in the long-term care of trees. And since 2001, I've been a small business owner of a small tree preservation company alongside my family, my father and my brother as well. And I spend most of my days aloft hanging from a rope the size of your pinky finger. So it's not for the faint of heart, but it certainly has been a very, very fulfilling career. Now, I specialize in urban arboriculture, which means I deal solely with trees that are found in urban environments. So when it came time to start a thesis, I knew that trees were going to be my topic, but I didn't know in what regard I was going to actually provide the thesis work on. What I ultimately realized was that since I work in urban trees so much, that clearly urbanization has changed the face of our landscape. We continue to decrease woodland forest, and therefore we turn around and we come in with urban forests, which are trees that are usually planted by landscapers and community planners. And the interesting thing is that these urban forests are almost as diverse and ecologically beneficial as a woodland forest, but unfortunately they do often see a lot of unseen consequences that the forest environment may not necessarily see. Some of these are improper tree pruning. This is something we would never do. This left picture of the Bradford pears that have been topped. That's improper tree pruning. Anthropogenic wounding, so therefore human-created wounds. You know, when we go around with lawnmowers and weed eaters and we hit the barks, these are wounds. And when I say the word wound, I want you to understand that means once that bark has been broken and we expose that internal wood. And lastly, of course, construction damages. Oftentimes we come in and we construct houses, fences, swimming pools right around the base of these trees, and these are structurally important roots that are becoming damaged by our activities. And lastly, driving over soil, crushing in roots and compacting the soil is not a beneficial practice that you see in forest environments. So why is wounding important? Well, wounding ultimately leads to tree decay. Every time we knock a hole in the bark surface and we expose that internal wood, we've opened an inoculation site for pathogens to enter the site of that tree. And once they are there, the process of decay cannot be reversed. It can only be slowed by chemical processes that the tree can actually present to the wound. And it's important because urban trees, on average, live about 34 years compared to a rural forest tree, which can live 150 years. And we know redwoods and other trees can live, in excess of 2,000 years if they are untouched, which we have very few of those remaining environments left. And in the urban environments, I wanted to study this because it's particularly hazardous to mainly people and property. If a tree falls in the forest, it may not hurt anyone necessarily, but when you're in an urban environment, you're often much more of a target than you would be in the forest. So my question was, well, are forest trees being wounded as readily as urban trees? And I had hypothesized that urban trees were going to have a higher rate of wounding than a forest counterpart. And also, on top of these wounds, that I figured these trees are also going to rank lower on a health ranking scale that I originated from 14 years of experience with trees. So for the next 15 months, I basically worked on this project. I picked a huge amount of data to go and look at. I ultimately hiked from December 14th to the 15th, in and out classes, in between classes. I would ultimately visit 10 total sites and look at 750 trees. I picked 5 urban sites and 5 forest sites throughout Middle Tennessee. I traveled in and out, but I stayed within the state. And I looked at 5 common genera that are basically found in all of these environments. They're native trees here to Tennessee, so they were easily, identified by myself. And I looked at more than 17,000 wounds in this process. This was a tremendous amount of data, and I'm still pulling results and looking at numbers on this data set. But I basically broke it into two individual categories. So the upper 4 on my 8 wound types, the open wounds, wound area wounds, and closed wounds, these were actual numerical counts where I sat there and I physically counted, okay, how many open wounds are there? Then I would measure the wound. And that would give me the wound area. How many small wounds, so woodpecker holes and wood-boring insects, what type of wounds were they creating? And then lastly, closed wounds, which I can show an example of that in a minute. How many wounds had actually closed and compartmentalized themselves? So those were numerical counts, but then to also get additional data, I looked at fungal conchs, girdling roots, pruning cuts, and root wounds. And this was just a yes/no. Was it there or was it not? And as much as I would have liked to have climbed all throughout the tree to get all this information, I just couldn't do that. The time didn't permit. So I stuck with only the bottom 3 meters of the tree. And what I found, and am still finding, is that open wounds are more prevalent in the urban environment, which makes sense. So the white bars are my urban trees. There's my 5 genera across the bottom. And we're seeing significantly more wounds as far as urban versus forest environment. So environment did play a role, and tree genre also played a role, with that being an example of an open wound. So how many of those did I see on each individual tree? And this was a standardized number, 2 meters squared, because all trees are different circumferences. So to account for that, I had to standardize everything down to number of wounds per meter of trunk. So more wounds in the urban environment. Okay, so counter this, we had closed wounds. This was another important metric because wound closure can stop that decay. Even though the decay has already begun internally, once the tree closes it, that no longer exposes that internal wood, so it lessens the chance of that decay spreading throughout the tree. And what we found here was more closed wounds in the forest environment, with environment and genre playing a significant role there again. So we had significantly more closed wounds in the urban environment, or closed in the forest environment, excuse me. And I'm going to move to the categorical counts now. This is kind of nothing extremely important, but as an arborist, it's more important to me probably because the first 3 categories, categorical wounds, are all created by humans anyway. So it's kind of a given. It makes sense that the urban environment's going to have more girdling roots, pruning cuts, and root wounds. Those are things that we do to trees oftentimes, whereas fungal conchs really didn't play a role. But basically, anthropogenic or human-created wounding was significantly more common in all of my categorical counts as well. Now, how does all this relate to the overall tree condition? Well, I had ranked trees. Every one I walked up to, I identified it with a number 1 through 5, trying to decide how healthy is this tree with regards to how wounded it was and how did the upper canopy rank as far as dead wood in the upper canopy. And what we found was all 5 genera were significantly in better condition in the forest environments. And that is correlated to that wound closure that I just explained earlier. So a healthier tree is better able to close these wounds than a tree that's stressed and suffering from additional wounding. So environment, genre, and interaction all played a role here. And this is really interesting to me because I think it's more that the forest environment is creating healthier trees that can in turn close these wounds at a faster rate than our urban trees. So final takeaway on this, anthropogenic wounding definitely increases the rate of wounding in urban trees. Healthier trees that are in the forest environment can better close their wounds. What I've basically found from my data is that the less interaction that humans have with trees, oftentimes the better condition they are going to be in. Therefore, they have a better chance at long-term survival. And lastly, I think that the best way for me to implement this and spread the word is that if we can just implement more of what we see in the forest environments into our urban environments, we're going to see more of that long-term survival. And what I mean by that is, laying down thick layers of mulch. So often we come in and rake all the leaves away from our trees, put them in a bag, and have someone pick them up. That's the worst thing that you could do for the tree. By keeping lawnmowers and weed eaters away from our tree trunks, we can decrease the rate of wounding around the trunks, one of the most structurally important parts of the tree. And also by staying off of the root zone, we don't increase that rate of erosion and expose those surface roots that then can be further damaged. And that's really about the end of trees. I hope everyone loves them as much as I do. So, yes.
One is, so when you went out to these 10 sites,
yes.
Did you just plant yourself there and then look at all the trees around them and did you randomize it?
So I did. It was totally randomized. I just walked until I found the species of tree that I was looking for. And I say species, I mean genre. I actually couldn't narrow this down to species because it gets very specific. So I chose broad genres of trees. So maple trees. If it was a maple, I would walk until I found a maple. Same thing with the hackberry.
And did you find 10 in that site?
That's correct. I actually, at each site, I had 5 genera, and I picked 15 of each tree genre. So I would walk until I had my 15 maple trees, 15 hackberry, 15 ash, and so on and so forth. So 75 trees per site times my 10 sites was my 750. That's correct.
The second question I had was about the tree that started with a Q. It was
Yes,
how did you say
Quercus oak tree.
That's what I was going to ask you what the name was, what its common name was. That one appeared almost to be the same in both conditions.
It did, and that's a great point. That's very good. So oak trees have this very thick furrowed bark, and I believe that is the reason why they are more resistant to wounding. If you go and you touch a hackberry tree versus an oak tree, one of them is smooth and a lot easier to break through that bark, the hackberry, whereas if you touch an oak tree, it'll almost cut your hand. So there's less chance of that wound actually creating a huge surface area, as we noted. So that was great, yes. Yep. Yes, Ms. Cliff.
In terms of, you said you wish that people would do certain things. If you had a magic wand,
yes,
you could make everybody in America do 1 or 2 things.
Okay.
What specific thing would you have them not do or do to make trees healthy? And you mentioned a couple things.
That's
I don't know if those
great.
are top ones or not.
So the first and most important would be putting the right plant in the right location. That would prevent the majority of all of this. When we plant trees that are 10 feet away from the foundation or 10 feet away from a road sign or a roadway, that in turn means that tree needs routine pruning. If that tree was set away from the building, we would have less wounds inflicted on it from us as a result of pruning. And the second most important would be establishing a defined bed for the tree so that no human even gets near the trunk. There's no chance of lawnmowers or weed eaters or driving over the soil structure there. So those would be certainly 2 things: the right tree in the right place, proper management of it after it's put in place, and then as little interaction with it as possible. Certainly some pruning will be needed from storm damages, but the less interaction we have with a tree, the better off it's going to be from what I've seen. Yes?
Curious, what does healthy pruning look like?
Okay, healthy pruning, if I could go, the closed wound, do you remember the wound that had closed completely? That is an example of a healthy pruning cut. So when you make a pruning cut, there is a shoulder, just like on a human being. There's what's known as a branch collar, and that is the swollen area right where the branch meets the actual trunk itself. And a proper cut will cut right to that shoulder, but not into the shoulder. And that is basically the tree's most natural way of shedding a dead branch on its own accord. So when you make a cut on a tree as a human, you want to get as close to that branch collar as possible so that the wound can compartmentalize and close completely as we saw. You never want to leave a nub that's a foot long, which is so common, and you don't want to cut it up against the trunk where it's so close that it then can spread throughout the trunk of the tree. So it's not easy. It takes time. It's a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science to get it accurate. But yep. Anything else? Yes.
With the carcass factory, since the rates, I guess, were so close, do you think there would be a way to maybe go back and compare how long it takes the wounds to heal up and do it that way? Like compare how long it takes the urban wound to the forest wound?
You certainly could. Unfortunately, the compartmentalization process can take years to complete. I mean, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years to close a wound entirely. You certainly could, and the interesting thing is with my study, I actually took GPS coordinates on every one of these 750 trees. So if I ever need to go back to any of them, I have their location, and I certainly could do that. So. But that is a little tricky because all trees also close at a different rate, and that's not just by genre, but even within a single genre, a pin oak may close at a different rate than a post oak, or, so not just by genre, but in an individual genre, you're going to see different rates of closure. So that would be a little tricky. You would have to certainly standardize that somehow, but yes, that would be interesting to see how quick each is closing. So, yes, sir.
What led you to first get interested in this field?
Oh man, that's a great question. So it was actually by chance, believe it or not. My father and brother started this. My dad was a pre-forestry major. Wound up getting out of forestry, went to psychology and social work. I guess he grew up and thought, I'm going back to my original love, and this is what he did. He started a small little business that basically after 2 years, he came to me and said, I need help, we need an extra person. And that kind of moved me into the role. And once we moved into the role of cutting trees, we realized real quick that we were a non-traditional company because we were a preservation company. And the average lumberjack does that tree topping that I showed in the first picture. That's the typical tree work that you get from a tree company. And what we found is that by creating our own little niche for tree preservation, the company actually really increased, a lot of steam. And by doing that, that was the encouragement that allowed me to say, okay, well, I probably should educate myself a little more. And then I became a certified arborist after that. And that was just a simple study and test. And I keep, continual education units that I have to recertify every 3 years with. So, yep. Yes, sir.
Besides the dangers of having the trees in urban environments falling over and damaging property and potentially people.
Yes.
Are there any other benefits to having older trees in urban environments?
Absolutely, absolutely. In urban environments, people obviously love trees. They've always loved trees. What's the first thing you do when you buy a house is plant a tree. But the aesthetic beauty of a tree isn't in the new sapling that you put in your front yard. It's often in the mature trees that have been there, since the day the house was built, ideally. But unfortunately, improper management of those trees warrants you moving in, thinking the tree's a hazard, and then cutting it down. So yes, there's a huge benefit. Ecologically, there's certainly bigger benefits because huge communities of animals and insects are there. You're looking at much greater water intake, so you have less erosion in your yard. Huge amounts of shade. You can decrease the your energy rates by up to like 1/4%. A quarter of the actual cost in just having a mature tree, next to your house. So there's a huge benefit to having mature trees, and there's some people that won't even buy a sterile lot with a little red maple in the front yard, So people seek out the big trees, certainly. So.
All right, please join me in thanking our